Thank you all. I'm looking forward to this program by Dr. Mark Moreno. He's going to be talking about the Silicon Valley Barrio Gangs. And he's been a professor for over, I think you said, 10 years?
As a, full-time faculty,
and, he's
11 years.
Professor out at Texas A&M University over at Commerce. And he's been in the area, gosh.
11 years here, yeah.
So,
oh, yeah.
And he's also written several articles and a variety of different things as well. And this month's sponsor is Gary Oxley, so thank you to him for helping us out this month. And so without further ado, I'll turn it over to him too, because I don't want to, it's too much.
Oh yeah, I know, yeah. So. Okay.
So he'll explain everything and looking forward to it.
Oh, thank you so much. And thanks for having me. Oh, I guess I should speak on the microphone. And thanks for having me, everyone. And I was mentioning to the ladies here, my father was a lover of all things military, and he was a fanatic about Audie Murphy. And so I saw the movie when I was 6 years old because he told me to watch it. And here's another funny thing. It's the late 1960s, and my mother was influenced by like the Chicano movement when my father wasn't. And so they got in an argument because Vietnam was happening at the time, and my dad was talking, like he killed 240 Germans, and then they had an argument about that, of course. But I have since seen the film maybe a few more times after that. So, he'd be very proud of my being here. He's passed away, but rest in peace. But he'd be very proud that I'm at a place that's named after Audie Murphy that has Audie Murphy memorabilia. So this is quite an honor. Thanks for the conversation earlier. I wanted to it's a personal story. I'm from that area, but not San Francisco, although I did have my hippie days there. I was from the south. You see the southmost county right there is Santa Clara County, which you all might have heard of. You all might have heard of Santa Clara University, which is the Jesuit university. And there's also San Jose State where I went and a lot of other people went. And it's traditionally, until the 1960s, from its very beginnings in the mid-19th century, and it started off, I don't know how much time I have, but part of the history is that one of the founding important families was called the Reed family, who actually survived the Donner Party tragedy in the snow, and were the only family that didn't eat human flesh. They were known for that. And they settled themselves in San Jose, and they formed, he had a big spread that was actually developed as residential housing way back in the late 19th century, and that later became a heavily concentrated Mexican-American neighborhood. And when I say Mexican-Americans, I do mean that because most of the people I'll be talking about were not bilingual, were not from Mexico, and did not even have parents from Mexico. It's a whole, and that's why I think it's an interesting story, because it's not like any other story like this, except for one similar community I studied up in Washington State it's the Yakima Valley, where I studied gangs, and it's sort of similar because they were products of American migration, basically. And whereas in LA, that went on for generations, and a lot of that was immigration originally from Mexico. But with this, it kind of happened all at once. Boom! And it carries on to this day in different forms. But there was a time when it was definitely in the public eye. And I experienced it as a newspaper reporter living in the same neighborhoods that I grew up in. And I wrote about these things as well. So that's the San Francisco Bay Area. Hope I get this right. So the South Bay is San Jose right there. And most of us growing up know it as San Jose rather than Silicon Valley, but everybody knows it as Silicon Valley. Perhaps you've heard of the San Jose Sharks, hockey team, of course. We were going to I don't like the Niners. We were going to get them there, though. People voted it down. So, yeah, that's why the Cowboys play the Niners. That's always fun. But and so, yeah, there's another view of the South Bay. Once again, it was an agricultural area, and after World War II, saw a boom in canned and packaged produce. So by 1960, it was probably the largest producer of canned produce, at least in the world. So Santa Clara Valley. That was a jobs magnet. Now, how it got to be a jobs magnet where other people totally bypassed LA to get there, that's the mystery I'm trying to sort of unravel as well, right? So there was a time, as we were talking about, and how people might perceive this as an urban thing, in my studies, what I've seen it as is more cultural for young people who, for some reason, latch onto it in the absence of any other kinds of options for recreation or at least self-importance. Does that make sense too? So if I ever say that, I say that to my freshman students a lot. Does that make sense? Because they're kind of like, and I say this. I want to make sure it makes sense there. So, but I don't have a problem here though. So if everyone heard of Pachucos, that originally is from El Paso, Texas. Have you heard of Pachucos?
When I was a seventh grader in Albuquerque, they were feared.
The Pachucos, right. I hear a lot of stories like that from people. There was a man I interviewed who was more than 80 years old, talked about in a bar in San Antonio. Somebody one of those guys, a Pachuco, I'll explain that right now, approached him and says, buy me a beer. And he used the slang word bironga. He said, hey, buy me bironga ese. That's the part of the slang. And he said, huh? And he said, hey. And he went like this. I said, buy me bironga. And the guy bought him a beer, and he went on his way. So Pachuco culture was sort of an alternate culture that kind of became the zoot suit culture in LA during World War II. And they were the focus of riots because of engagements and conflict with servicemen, including Mexican-American servicemen who served in LA. Known as the Zoot Suit Riots. Eventually, servicemen, especially sailors, piled into groups of taxis looking for these Pachucos. And I'll show you this. Today, they're totally nice clothes. They're like sports coats and, creased pants. But they actually tore the clothes off them and left them on the sidewalk. And there are pictures of young boys in their underwear, like in front of theaters and things like that in LA at the time. But for some reason, now that's kind of the history of it, but it seemed that whole incident seemed to only make that culture grow. LA has much greater baggage than San Jose does. I'm glad I didn't grow up there. Not only has it much greater baggage, but when I talk about the clusters of people, it's much larger. East LA has 1 million people. I mean, when you had the bad stuff over there, you still do, but not like before, but there's like 1 million people there. And when I've taken the train through LA, the feeling I get is when you're there, you can't get out. It feels like you're trapped. Now, San Jose is a lot different. It was smaller, and the lines between neighborhoods were more blurred. Does that make sense? So sometimes the nice neighborhood would be right there, and the barrio, as I call it, Mexican-American, more working class, sometimes poor, that would be just across the street. And nobody would go over there. Well, because the police made sure, too, because they were always cruising around the neighborhood, seeing if we're up to trouble or something like that. My own neighborhood was surrounded what we call Japantown, where people had been interred during World War II, and their property was preserved, and they came back, and it's still a neighborhood, but now it's a little more trendy. It's a place where sushi restaurants are. But I know people that I grew up with who still have their family home, the nicest homes in the area, bonsai trees, right? Are surrounded by the barrio, not anymore so much because everything's gentrified, but back in the day, surrounded by these bad neighborhoods. Nobody did anything bad at all in Japantown. There wasn't much to do at that time. Now it's all trendy and, but like the whole place has become. And I wanted to mention this too. The migrant stream, and I have a map that kind of depicts that. There are different versions of that. A lot of that, some comes from Mexico to work the fields. And there have been populations as high up as Michigan, right, that are still there. And I have family members in Pittsburgh as well, right? And they went to Washington State where I talked with people who were descended from them. And so a lot of them, though, even to this day, you have migrants from Texas who have homes in the borderlands, but they pick stuff, apples or whatever, in Washington State, and then they go back to live maybe 3 months out of the year. They have their homes there, though. So their home is Texas, and you still have that population, right? So this is the kind of community that had migrated to Northern California, and it's also traditionally, El Paso is acknowledged by law enforcement and whatever scholars have done, whenever they've studied this, that's where that culture emanated. It's called Pachuco culture, but it morphed into something else later. What they retained was like a slang type of thing, right? It's not Spanish, really. It's like an argot, if you know, And it's been described as an argot by sociologists, which is technically a criminal sort of language, although not all of them were criminals. It's kind of really complicated, right? A lot of it's a lifestyle, too. It's an alternate lifestyle. And for these men in El Paso at the time, we don't know exactly a whole lot about them. My grandmother talks about them. She was born in El Paso, so she talks about the Pachucos. And sometimes, being high on morphine, she'd talk about, like in the 1920s, right? My grandfather never wanted to associate, that's the family story, never wanted to associate with him, and then eventually took the family up there. And then my dad and uncles got involved in San Jose, California, of all places. So the original culture, Pachuco culture, which became, if you know the word cholo, has everyone? A lot of people in Texas know that word. I was in Washington, and they're like, oh. But here, a lot of people know what a cholo is. It's basically the same slang with different clothing. Does that make sense, right? And we'll talk about why they did that. There's a lot of reasons, and we'll talk about that right now. So, or did I moved the wrong button there. So that's a zoot suit. These pictures are LA. I don't know who the heck these guys are, but that's how they look maybe today. Does that make sense? Not even like that a lot. Well, they have the traditional creased clothing. A lot of versions of how this happened came out of veterans. They say veterans came from World War II with their army creases, with their creased pants, and that influenced the younger people who started creasing. And I did that. I creased my T-shirts when I was 16. Is that crazy? And I have some creased. I didn't bring them today. I didn't want to make a bad impression. I do have creased jeans. But my dad always had creases in his pants no matter what. So that's the zoot suit. It's adapted from African Americans who wore much more flamboyant, though, much more colorful. It also was, one version is that the suit came from Gone with the Wind and Rhett Butler and those clothing, like from the late 1930s, because that's where it kind of is traced to, right? So there were, that started as an African-American style. If you see the movie Malcolm X, and they have these very colorful, and they're going like this, they never did, they're much more conservative. That's the oppression. That's what the older people will tell you that have had contact with them, right? So massive migration to San Jose, especially after World War II. I've interviewed now more than 40 people, including relatives, including people I've known since I was younger. And of all the people I interviewed, the vast majority had parents both from the United States. There are some families, maybe a quarter to a third of them, that had at least one person from Mexico, but almost none had both parents from Mexico. My mother's family came from Mexico, my father's came from El Paso. And so I'm a product of that as well. That means, because a lot of those older generations that actually were bilingual and spoke mostly in Spanish, even though they were American, but they didn't want the children to speak Spanish, so my generation ended up not being bilingual. I had to actually go to Mexico in my 30s to do a program in Spanish. But we knew the slang, of course, and we knew the curse word. Everybody knows the curse words, right? And it was a kind of a cultural thing. We didn't eat corn tortillas that much. Everybody ate flour tortillas. I think that's a product maybe of Texas, maybe of northern Mexico. Certain cultural things were different than someone purely from Mexico, right? That is a modern take on the migrant streams of America. And you do have a lot of them, of course, the majority from Mexico probably today, whereas in the older days, the people that came into San Jose earlier were not of generally, or they didn't work in agriculture when they went to San Jose. And actually, a lot of this earlier were Americans involved in farm work. And there still is a population of Texans that go up to Washington State working in this, because they're just used to it. It's just a thing they do, right? And so now this is probably more immigrant than anything else. No, we can thank people like Cesar Chavez for that. There's no Mexican-American today who is younger or any age probably that would do that work unless they live in Washington State or some other places, or one of the Texas people that do that. But by and large, it's mostly immigrant. And that's anecdotal. That's something that I could actually check and double check in secondary sources. And it's not really the focus of what I'm doing here. But there is established work that talks about that early population as being American. Does that make sense? So one of the narratives is that they had lost. Now, I don't know how true this is because people have agendas sometimes. One of the narratives is that when they lost the territory to the United States, what was left behind was an agricultural population that even when they could retain their property, lost it over time because they couldn't keep up with mechanization or whatever else it is, right? So they ended up being farm laborers rather than being owners of property. And that's a narrative that I probably have to reference somewhere, right? But that's something that's the narrative that's kind of come down. And these people that migrated to Northern California here, they're from, I guess, this is Del Rio, I guess about right there, right? A big chunk of this migrant stream actually came from Del Rio and other places nearby, like Eagle Pass. My dad's family is from El Paso, but I have not met anybody like my family from El Paso, but a whole bunch of people from Del Rio, including like lawyers, politicians, and people whose kids became gang members, right? And people who had been in gangs in the 1950s. And that's where this is kind of traced to. But for some reason, and that's the mystery I'm trying to get to, it's going to take a little bit of time, is why did they do that, right? Unless there was an agricultural population here that needed to go somewhere else because that work dried up, I'm not sure, but it was just a massive migrant wave, and not only mostly from Texas, but also New Mexico and Arizona. And I've interviewed people whose parents come from Arizona, and I've seen in secondary literature, I've heard about people from New Mexico as well. But I would say mostly Arizona in my experience, and mostly from the borderlands of Texas, right? One family came from actually San Antonio, and I interviewed him not too long ago. So, these are guys I knew in high school. I just remember two of them. This man is named Lewis, of all things. That's his real name, I guess, in the Anglo version of that. This is Julio, who I still see once in a while out at the park where we all used to hang out at. But this style of clothing at this point was not being worn very long. Within the past couple of years, that's when everybody all of a sudden started dressing like this. And that's an influence from the Pachuco generation from Texas. The creased clothing, the khakis, these are supposed to be khakis, or Ben Davis work pants. There were a couple of stores even that exist today that cater mostly to old guys like me who still wear things like that once in a while. I do it now, it looks perfectly respectable now, but I remember crossing the street in clothes like that and people actually locking their doors. And I'm like, little old me? Come on. So, yeah, so these are people from my high school, San Jose High School. And I've talked about, Santa Clara Valley in the 1950s, as I mentioned, was the largest producer of packaged produce, I believe mostly cannery goods at the time, came out of the Santa Clara Valley. This is the old downtown San Jose. So it looks like very urban, which I guess it was. During the 1970s, there probably was around 500,000 people, I guess urban enough at the time. In the 1950s, definitely more rural, right? My father-in-law had been a bracero who actually worked out there from Mexico. Of course, he went back to Mexico after. But he talks about this place as being a pueblo, like a very small place. And other people over the years that I ran into in my life as a journalist would say, oh, San Jose, that's boring, it's just a little town. They were saying this in the 1970s and 80s too, right? But now it's pretty huge. There's like 1 million people, and it's hard to buy a house unless you're a multimillionaire, because average home prices are $1.5 million for anything. And we talked about how do you eradicate gangs. Well, that pretty much has done it, except in a few cases. Does that make sense? And this is the Jose Theater. Is that, well, I was going to say, one of my favorite theaters. You can go to movies for $0.25 for 3 movies, especially kung fu movies. And it was an old vaudeville house. And it's still there, fortunately preserved by the local historical society, the kind of work that you folks do here. So, right? Newberry's, I don't know if anyone remembers Newberry's, but that's an old chain back there. That's what it looks like today. They can't build the buildings very big because there's an airport in the way. And I don't know why they built the airport right in the path of where the buildings are. So they have a size limit. So they don't have the tall skyscrapers there. But it's all sprawl. It goes way, way out here now, right? And so they have a light rail, fortunately. They do have some forms of public transit. But it has traditionally been a commuter community, just like the LA area as well, right? This is the vacuum, or this is the world where the gangs appear. So there are gangs. My research, or at least also from my father's oral histories, there was a gang, several gangs in the 1950s, might have been influenced by the movies, if you remember, the Petrified, or the Blackboard Jungle, and Rebel Without a Cause, all these types of things. So they were jacket gangs. My father was in a gang called, I should actually put it back there, because that's when, he actually had a jacket that said the Blue Velvets, and they were like the biggest gang at the time, and they wore their hair in a pompadour. And actually, they credit the police chief at the time in the late 50s with initiating youth programs for eradicating a lot of that. So that's what he said. My father says that, and I actually have seen the news stories. San Jose Mercury News at one time was one of the top 10 newspapers in the United States, right? So at that time, I guess they don't describe, and nobody got killed, they got in fights, and most of the gangs were Mexican-American at the time. There was a white gang, he said, called the East Side Dukes, before the East Side became all Mexican-American. So there were no African-Americans, very much at all. There never has been, really. And the ones that were there, they lived in the neighborhoods of Mexican-Americans. Whether it's redlining or they couldn't buy it somewhere else, they ended up in that neighborhood. But they normally didn't get involved in these things. Some people did. And that's just something I'll get into now, the whole culture itself. Let me see, right? So there was history of gangs in the 50s. There were gangs in the 1960s, right, of different kinds. Not Pachuco or Cholo gangs, just with the jacket, right? But there were no like real casualties. A lot of it was fist fighting, right? If they fought with weapons, it was usually boards or maybe knives. Firearms didn't really come into play until the early 1990s, and that's when they started shooting at it. That's when it got really bad at that point, right? So this magazine was founded in San Jose in 1976. I don't know if you've seen it, but it did eventually go mainstream, and it went out of business, but for 30 years, it was a mainstream magazine because he sold it to a major company. It started out like in a garage, just depicting lowrider culture and always putting women on the culture or girls on the cover, right? Sonny Madrid is legendary in San Jose for doing this, and this magazine went all over the Southwest. In Washington State, there were people I interviewed who said they were influenced to wear cholo clothes because this magazine was available there. And I do remember a time when we waited for the next issue to come out. Oh, Lowrider's coming out. You'd have to know where to go, though. It would be like at a liquor store or something like that, right? So that's Sonny Madrid, and that's one of the examples of it. And there's a couple of youth cultures, and we all know about youth culture. I don't know if you all had some kind of thing you were into as a young person. You definitely had a lowrider culture, but that was mostly late teens, early 20s, right? People with jobs who had dropped out of school so they could get a job, so they could fix a car like that and then go cruising around. That was the thing everybody wanted to do, a lot of these guys. They say, I got my car, I got my old lady, you know. Unfortunately, they found out that wasn't the key to everything, and they ended up, you know, maybe becoming alcohol and drugs, divorce, the whole thing. But that's what it was. And you could go to King and Story streets in San Jose just flooded with cars. It became the lowrider capital of the world, even more than LA. LA people would go there to cruise the boulevard, right? I wish I didn't have, that gives me the idea later to add that. This man here, Jesse Perez in the bandana, we talked about the blue and red, but at this point it was not distinguishable at the time. Jesse Perez in the passenger seat right there. He has, his father's from Mexico, his mother's from Mexico, his father's not from Mexico, but that household was bilingual, which was relatively rare at the time. He grew up speaking Spanish. So they had been in a gang called Los Locos de San Jo. It wasn't a Pachuco gang. They wore black derby jackets with green lettering on it. I remember those guys because when I went to high school, they weren't prohibited to, you know, they walk around with their jacket, you know, like 4 or 5 guys. And so one day, or at least at one point, it's about 1977, 2 guys from LA ended up in that neighborhood. And they came from a gang that's called Vickystown. That's in LA. Today, there's branches in Stockton and LA and also in Mexico, too, because they brought the culture there. Mexicans in Mexico didn't start doing this until Americans started going there. Does that make sense? Because it's a culture. More than anything, it's a culture. And I started wearing my own clothes like that, although I did get in trouble at one point, but not like some other people did. Because you didn't have to be in a gang to dress like that. But in this case, the guys from LA, this is his direct oral history. They were all getting loaded, and this was happening along with that too. And one of the other baggage, I guess, the community has is there was a high school dropout rate. I believe a lot of the parents who had come from Del Rio earlier did not have much schooling. What they believed was if their children just got it, and they eventually worked, had children, go to grandma's house for Sunday menudo, then everything was going to be good. That was their world. And they believed that was going to happen here. But the thing, as you all know, right, generations change. Expectations change. So they weren't going to just go to high school, drop out, kind of lounge around, find a job, and then start having babies and happily ever after. It wasn't going to be like that. They needed, for some reason, that's another thing that hopefully the oral histories can sort of impart, is why they even needed to do that at all. Just to dress like that, and they're kind of in a lowrider. And so, for some reason, they were influenced by these guys. They were in a garage, and by that time, there was drugs in the community, especially PCP. San Jose was the PCP capital of the world at one time. A lot of my friends, they just, they all got into it. It's very highly psychologically addictive, right? So they were smoking PCP and marijuana. They had cheap wine, of course, Ripple, they used to drink, and Thunderbird, all those, Mad Dog 2020, if you remember all those things. So they were in the garage getting loaded, and then the guys would tell them, okay, it's time now. Now you got to be Vickystown. So they shaved all their heads. And the exact quote from Jesse Perez is, we walked out just all bald, all these white heads. And they're all loaded. And all of a sudden he said, congratulations, you're in Vickystown. And they became Vickystown, one of the most feared gangs in San Jose, Jesse Perez. Jesse Perez now is a pastor of Victory Outreach Church in Dallas, Texas. And a lot of these people, like Jesse, either became pastors or affiliated with a church, especially evangelical churches, which helped them to sort of clear up their lives. And fortunately, I was able to interview people from the churches, right? Not everybody's willing to do that, but where I found quite a few people who were affiliated with churches, just like Jesse, who gave me a long story. His sister was also in the gang, Mary Perez. She was an official gang member, relatively rare for girls, right? And we're talking mostly about teenagers. I've heard stories about, they say that gangs, the girl has to have sex with every guy. I've never seen that in my entire life. Or the initiation where they flick their lights on at a car and then they go, I've never seen that, no. There was really no initiation to speak of, but because she was Jesse's sister and they're the founding members, she was respected as one of the guys. So she didn't. And also what came later was to become part of the gang. This is true, they'd have to be beat up by gang members, and then they're initiated. But for this generation, they didn't tend to do that. There were some radical elements out there that did, but mostly they didn't. You just became, once you claim something, that means you would die for it. So if I claim Vickystown, that means I would die for it. And I'm expected to help them when something goes wrong. I might have an anecdote later about that while I was going to college, actually. Because neighborhoods, everybody knew each other, and there are different sides to the neighborhoods. Now, I'm from the north side. I hope I have a map that kind of brings that out here somewhere. So this is, her name is Ana Garcia. She wants to go by Weta. That's not correct spelling of that word. It means light-complected. It's with a G usually. But she goes by that, and she joined a girl gang, and they were smoking PCP at the age of 14. And she joined a girl gang called the Queen Cobra. And she was about 14. She's my age. I'm 62 now. So she's doing real well. She's retired, actually, has a lowrider, and goes. Now all these people are old, and there's no trouble. They have these events, and everybody's old, and they have their lowrider, so no problem. But she's from where I'm from, and I grew up with her. And she has an interesting story because not only was she part of a gang, she also not really ran away from home because she wasn't really rebelling against anybody. Nobody here was actually rebelling against their parents, technically. There were some issues with Mary, and her dad was quite macho, and she's a woman. So this was a way for her to express some kind of identity, right? Some kind of space or strength, right? Because of her father's being strict, but that's not the case with Anna. She did end up not running away from home, but hitchhiking to LA, where she was almost raped, where she stole a pair of 501. That's how she became a chola, because she opened a dresser drawer and there were a pair of 501 jeans, I guess creased, and the world opened for her. She became like a chola after that, and eventually made it back to San Jose, and now doesn't live far away, though. Very interesting story, though. I would not say, of course, nobody would suggest that anybody do this anymore. So it might have been a different time. Maybe she was lucky, too, because it was a different time like that, right? And there was a music. Does that work, you think, if I play that on? Is this hooked up to the internet? Okay, that's okay. I was going to show you an example of music, because not only is it the clothes, it's a style of music. It's older art, sort of rhythm and blues. A lot of it obscure because it was like in the California market or the LA market, right? There's a song called Angel Baby. I was going to play that right now. On the screen? Oh, Oh. Oh, because. Oh, maybe not. I'll try it one more time. Oh yeah, YouTube. So this is the music, a lot of music like this we listen to. So it's wearing the clothes, the creased clothes. It's using the slang. Oh, it's an Apple advertisement, I guess.
Those advertisements always come on first.
Oh yeah, she's up there. I mean, the singer is up there. Yeah, yeah. Oh, that's why I had to go to YouTube Premium after a while, because I got tired of all this. I don't do Spotify. So that's like an anthem. That's the first song like this that I had ever heard. And there was a way of dancing too, where the guys would have when they're slow dance, this hand would have to be down, because they had to show how much, how strong they were, I guess. And they'd be like this. Now, my wife today is from Mexico. I always joke around with her and say, like, hey, can we dance like this? No. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, this is a song that people got drunk and drugged out to for sure. Yeah, that's so. But the thing was, they formulated this culture that they borrowed from somewhere else. And it happened overnight, which is different from LA, which took generations to kind of build up to that. This happened overnight. Boom. A new population of teenagers by the 1970s, children of the people who had migrated from these places in the Southwest. Right, so I guess we could turn it off now. Hey, that's not supposed to be in Spanish. It's not in Spanish, yes. The original version is not in Spanish. And like I said, Anna's not bilingual, Jesse was, and other people were not, right? So, oh, and this is another, this is part of a study I'm doing called Chicano youth culture in San Jose. This is someone I also knew from college who actually she didn't want to be part of the gangs, right? So she got involved in a dance culture. There was the favorite disco was called Studio 47. It was the only game in town, and it was crowded with people looking in their barrio best sometimes, right? And they adapted these disco clothes. I remember I had a bow tie at one point with a wingtip collar. I know. And these Bogart pants, we call them, bless you, with Bogart pants with I know it sounds ridiculous. She dressed like that, and she belonged to a club that they got together and they danced, in unison and all that. So that was an alternate version of that, although it's because she did not want to get involved in the gangs. And there's a snapshot of Studio 47 on a given weekend, right? The crazy thing about this is it had a minor section and it had an adult section, and the adults could actually go into the minor section. So there were these predators out there, not in the serial killer way, just predators trying to pick up on a young girl. They could totally do that by going to the minor section. This is the 1970s.
What year was this?
I think if it's the heyday, I'm figuring it's about 1980, right? And that went on for a while, but the heyday, like the big heyday, was about 1980. This is my cousin Jordan Bergerson, actually, because his father is of Swedish descent, who was actually became part of another kind of, it's not a gang, it's a tagging crew, where they just did their names, right? So, of course, he got in trouble. And he didn't want to be in gangs either, so that's why he did that. Because in some cases, in his case and in Elsa's case, he's from the north side like I am, she's from the west side, but still, you couldn't be around that without getting into something. If you're not going to be a cholo, then you had to do something else. You couldn't just be on your own because you wouldn't have any friends. Does that make sense? There was a point in my life where I just decided to stay in my room so as not to get into trouble. I was going to show some other thing too. Yeah, that's his tagging. Have you seen us? It actually came out in the paper. Yeah, so and so I wanted to show you this too. These are the sides. So San Jose, you saw that sprawl, right? But with this migration, they began to settle in the central areas. There was a much bigger sprawl here. This is the east, and this is the north, and this is the south, and that's the west. This side here was not really a barrio, right? It was new developments. A lot of this was too. If you get down to Willow Glen, that's mostly a middle-class, like white neighborhood. Today it's very mixed. My mom lives there actually. So, but here was the west side. This is the north side, which is actually central, and at least the northern half of these things were the east and south sides. So it was clustered with Mexican Americans, right? Of course, now I've heard different things and I've studied different things. There is a scholar named James Diego Vigil who's written about, he calls Choloization. how people become cholos. And his argument was that they don't have access to the wider community, either services or contact with other people. And so they clustered and formulated their own youth cultures, especially gang cultures, but they tended to be very self-destructive because they took drugs and alcohol without any inhibitions whatsoever. I remember walking around trying to be a badass with a cigarette when I'm 11, shocking the older ladies out there. I don't smoke anymore. My wife made me give it up, but there's problems associated with this cluster too, because when you start having a concentration of crimes, even petty crimes, police start to, and it becomes sort of colorized, where the police really patrol these areas a lot, and they tend to stop people or frisk people or otherwise be in their lives. Does that make sense? So, justified or not, it creates a sort of resentment. And it even creates a resentment among parents and other families here, right? It's changed now, right? Things are different now. But also, especially when you started getting in the 1980s, when Chief Joseph McNamara instituted the San Jose model of law enforcement, which was much more vigilant, but they still didn't go away because by the early 1990s, there was an explosion of violence. And not only that too, there's also been like 3 major prison gang cases out of San Jose, starting in 1992 when 25 members of the Nuestra Familia gang, our family in Spanish, were indicted. The largest indictment up to that time in Santa Clara County, the largest death penalty case. Only 2 got the death penalty and 2 others got life imprisonment. One of them I do interview. He's been doing 2 life sentences there. But also their stories are when you look at all the stories, they're very varied. Now, the one guy I interviewed in prison, he actually he grew up bad. He just got in fights all the time, always got kicked out of school. Nobody else in his family did things like that, but he did. I don't know if it's the absence of a father, because I don't think he was all that familiar with his father. I mean, he wasn't totally absent, but he didn't have a lot of contact. That might be something, so I'm not sure. But there are other people, Jesse Perez, Mary, they had a perfectly nuclear family, hardworking family. It just didn't matter, but I think the cluster is kind of the problem as well, too, right? The problem with, now I don't have children, but I would be conscious of a young person's identity, which is very important. If their identity is of themselves as a loner, especially at that time, I mean, it's hard to live with. It's not sustainable. Does that make sense? Now they're on the internet going nuts, which is, right, so I'm glad, thank you, that we don't have the internet right now when I was growing up, because I had books, and that's how I learned to read, and I didn't have to take remedial classes in college or anything like that. So, but also the problem is, out here, the San Jose Unified School District kind of cuts through the center of town, including the barrio areas. At one point, they actually dictated that nobody could cross boundaries. So they made sure that the majority Mexican-American schools stayed majority Mexican-American, and they often had very high, at the time I hear like a 60% dropout rate. And very permissive. You could go out to the back and do whatever vice you wanted to engage in because there was a park back there, but nobody was watching. It was also an open campus. You could walk off anytime you wanted. There was also a smoking section. I guess other places had that too. But it was ruled by a federal judge in the mid-1980s that the district officials were intentionally doing that because of race, intentionally segregating by race. So it was not only de facto, it was actually intentional. That order was never challenged. It's to this day in place. If you look up San Jose Unified, it's the last major desegregation case in American history, was my school district, right? So that's one of the, I guess you would say, structural effects of that type of clustering. I don't want to call it technically segregation. What happened here, this was an older generation of Portuguese and Italian families, but they moved out here to the suburbs. The more it expanded, the more they moved out, and that allowed this population to settle there, where they became clustered. And policies, there might be a tinge of race in there because we didn't have this in the history of San Jose until this point in the 1970s. My grandparents went to San Jose in the 1930s. They were one of maybe several hundred families, but they were mostly from Mexico at that time. You remember, there was a lynching in 1934, James Thurmond and Jack Holmes. There were 2 white men who had actually kidnapped and murdered a prominent local son named Brooke Hart, and they were lynched in the middle, not far from where I grew up in 1934. right? So, and then there was one oral history in one book that talked about the Mexican community just stayed in their house the whole time. So, right? So that might have been my grandparents, I don't know. But by the time you get to the late 40s, that's when my father's side is part of that wave that comes in there. So one of the mysteries is, right, I always ask people, why they do this, why they do what they do, including the prison gang members that I've talked to. I keep on asking them over and over. They can't really give you a solid answer, but they did tend, even in a school where they knew white kids growing up, no problem, but as soon as they got to high school, they tended to gravitate to the others. Now, if you all have children, I guess, do you see kind of issues like that where they need to belong somewhere or something like that? And for some reason, they kind of just click with certain people or whatever. A lot of that is what we're talking about here, right? They gravitate to a certain group in high school, and then they tend to live in these areas, and then they tend to identify with gangs or with some other culture if they don't want to be in gangs, right? And it tends to be self-destructive. Fortunately, many of these people have survived. I mean, they're in churches or something else, right? Part of my study now is actually looking at a murder case in San Jose that involved the members, the prison gang members of the Nuestra Familia. There were 6 murders involved in that case. The guy I talked to was convicted of one of them, and it involved people from my neighborhood, the north side. I grew up about in this area right here, where the old downtown is. We loved it. I loved it over there. So, but then, of course, it got taken over by people from the halfway houses and prostitutes at some point. But as a little kid, yeah, that was great. Went to a boxing gym, so down there. But, that's what I was saying as well. Before I lost my train of thought here. The murders. The murders, yeah, Nuestra Familia murders. So it involves 6 murders from all over this section, right? And but the one that I'm focusing on happened in my neighborhood among people I knew. So it's kind of a personalized thing. So what I'm trying to do is it's a murder story, but it's also a story of the community because the way I'm doing it is interviewing or doing oral histories with both the perpetrators and the victim's family. Does that make sense? And I have the guy I talked to, the man in prison, actually sold me his entire court documents. So basically, I don't really need anything except the oral histories. I've gone to the California State Archives. I don't need, as a reporter, San Jose with the efficient law enforcement, they never talked. It was really frustrating being a crime reporter in San Jose because they wouldn't say anything. It wasn't like some other places, right? I would have loved to do it out here, though. It seems like they like to. I talked to a homicide detective right now in Rockwell. But for this particular thing, since it's an adjudicated case and they're all old people, I'm not going to talk to anybody who's involved now because I already have problems as it is because when you deal with people out of prison, right? They're always asking for favors. And you got to keep an arm's length sometimes. But he has an interesting story because he ended up being convicted, and all he did was acknowledge that a hit was put out on the victim. He didn't order it. Somebody else did. But he acknowledged it, and he was a prison gang member. And he has a tattoo that says Familiano, or he used to. He had a spider web on his face. It's amazing, too. He used to get in fights and kicked out of school, but he's like 6 foot tall, nice-looking guy. I was thinking, why did you didn't have to do that. I saw his wife also sort of in that world, 5'10", like a model. So you can't pinpoint why people do this based on appearance, based on where they come from. It's complicated, but it also is culture. You get into something and that's what you do, and that's what he did. He spent a good part of his life incarcerated, and that became his life, his culture, and he became part of the prison gang, which if you're in one part of, in this subworld, and you're the king of that world, there really is no reason to get out of it until you get in major trouble. Now he regrets it. And he tells me all the time, he says, I wish I would have done it the way you did. And I like to tell gang members that nowadays, right? Because now he regrets all that. He wishes he had done that. And when he actually started going to community college, and he was about to take his finals, and then he got busted for that case, and got arrested for that case there, right? So, it's too late at that point, right? And so that's the case I'm focusing on beyond the youth culture study that I'm doing. I'm trying to probably submit an article in the spring, but this would be more of a nonfiction book. It's a story of a community, right? And I'm getting their stories up until the moment this happens. And they tended to be from where I'm from. And that's a lot of these guys from these earlier days have all got out of prison, right, after serving 27 years or whatever. This one man, has anyone heard of the Mexican Mafia? Or 35?
In there stay 35.
For,
Good for 35 years.
oh, they get out? Okay, so.
They get out at 35.
Oh, okay, so, well, yeah.
It was a lot since.
Yeah, well, they got to be some pretty mean guys there. Yes, for this state, they got to be pretty mean out here. So, right. So, for that particular case, Eddie his name is Eddie. Well, I was going to say his last name. I guess it doesn't matter. He's on that. If you look him up, you could look him up. But he was never part of that gang culture technically until he got out. Right? So mostly he was in juvenile hall or some other institution. Then when he would get out, then he would be involved in that culture. Does that make sense? But mostly he wasn't in the neighborhood. He was gone. But he did influence his cousins, the way he dressed, and who he was. He was the top dog in there. I mean, one of the shot callers, not the ultimate, but one of the shot. And that's right. The way I would admire a famous historian, or that's how they would admire like people in their lives like that. And so that's how it would be. It would be a series of oral histories leading up to that murder. But the case files has all of it in there. And so that would be the next. I don't know. You can tell me if that sounds like a good idea or not. But something, if you like true crime, does anybody like true crime? There you go. So it would be a murder story, but also a community, a history story. But that's later. Yeah. I have all the documents. For right now, I'm focusing on the youth culture. And most of those people have not stayed in that life. Right? Some people are dead. I was interviewing one former member of the Nuestra Familia who died of a heroin overdose eventually. Yeah. He was a Christian. He was going to church. But he just, the demons, I mean, the whole thing. So, and some other guy who actually murdered the member of the boss of the Mexican Mafia. Has anyone seen American Me, that movie? Have you seen that? Remember at the end when they got him? So that was based on a real event. The guy who did it, I interviewed him for 2 hours this past summer. They call him Tiny Contreras because he's this small. Still dresses like creased pants. Still has his Pendletons all creased. But he told me the whole story and the whole rundown. And early on, he did get in trouble. Like, he told me the same thing. In grammar school, I got along with everybody. I knew a lot of white kids. Started going to high school. All of a sudden, he started getting into trouble. And he actually started dealing heroin as a teenager. That's confirmed by a story my father told me about him and my uncle and Tiny making a heroin run, like in California. And so he didn't remember my father, but he remembered my uncle. Because my father was probably a little punk just tagging along at the time. So I interviewed him for 2 hours, which is part of the story because it's part of the wider sort of prison gang war story between the Nuestra Familia and the Mexican Mafia. That's no time to talk about that right now, but that seems like that would be something that's personal for me rather than academic in some way, right? So, and the perpetrator of that murder that I'm focusing on, I went to high school with him, and as soon as when he was in prison, I asked his mother to tell him to call me as a newspaper reporter, and he said, "Who's this? Mark, who are you?" I said, "I'm Duck. Do you remember me?" "Duck, yeah." Oh, no, he didn't say. I said, "This is Mark Moreno." He said, "Duck," because that's what they used to call me back in the days. So he knew me by my nickname. So Tiny lives with him. That's his father-in-law. San Jose is so weird. It's so interconnected like that. Like the 6 degrees of separation is just incredible because it's a lot smaller than LA. We knew people from way in the other side of town. Who's there? Oh yeah, I know them. Because it's basically a small town shelled in a bigger city, isn't that? And that's what makes it unique. And that's what makes the story of, say, gang membership and gang culture, as I call it. My colleague Mike Tapia says subculture because that's what the criminologists say. I call it a culture, right? Cultures are everywhere. And it's more than just inner city or rural. It is a culture, and when the conditions are right for that, with a certain youthful population, it's going to take hold. Because we were all kids. I was a stupid kid at one point, right? Where it was cool with me if I got arrested or something, if I got in trouble with the cops. Oh, I'm being a big man now. I'm being cool. So right. Of course, I didn't last long in that. So it was just hard to. Yeah, there was a time though, a police officer was right at my doorstep, asking for me because we had done something bad. So right. But I figured even before high school, it's like, you know what? I don't like the situation here. And that's when I started like not answering my door, and I eventually went to live with my dad who lived far away. So to get out of that, when I came back, I was about 18, 19, there were already people who had been killed, not necessarily for murder, just doing stupid things, being loaded, driving a car into a swimming pool, and stuff like that, right? So there was already like 2 guys I knew that were dead already by the time I came back within a year from living with my father, right? And my father lived in Ventura, Southern California, but fortunately I didn't know anybody, so I wasn't going to get in trouble or anything like that. So, but I did have to step away because it was getting too deep. I had already dropped out of high school. It was getting too deep, and I had to get the heck out of there. And when I came back, that's when I was, after a period of some confusion, I entered college and the whole thing, got a GED, At the time, I only did it because my mother wanted me to. I wasn't going to do it, but I did it. Fortunately, you don't need that for college in California, but it was a milestone to just get that, right? And I like to tell students the freshmen tend to think in terms of, if I don't do this, I'm a loser. If I don't do that, I'm a loser. And I got to say, no, I got to say, it's still America. I mean, if you have the will, if you have the mindset to do something, you can still do that. For some reason, they're not getting that. But I guess that's another story we can talk about later on. So, well, thank you all. I'm sorry. I hope I didn't take too much time, but if you have any questions, I guess we have a few minutes. Any questions about any of this? There.
You mentioned America Me, one, Blood In, Blood Out.
Oh, yeah.
Is definitely shows the culture of...
Yeah. It does show the street culture as well, doesn't it? Yes, that's right.
The very first, before the young man goes to prison, and then it shows more of the prison gang, Rolanda and...
Right, there was supposed to be Mexican Mafia. There's 4 major prison gangs, maybe 5. The Mexican Mafia is Southern California and Texas and other places. There is a Texas Mexican Mafia, and that was founded because of the other one, too. There is, Nuestra Familia is almost exclusively Central and Northern California, right? Much smaller. But it's still funny because they're how indoctrinated they are. Even from where we are, such disparagement in how people are. You can have a judge. I think I like to say that we're like how Jews used to be in the 40s and 50s. You could have a judge and a gangster in one family. That's kind of how it is with Mexican Americans in many places now today, right? Just, yeah, so here too. Oh, yeah. Yes. Yeah, I've heard about Dallas. I've had students from out there too, but... So, yeah, any other, I'm sorry, if you...
You mentioned you're teaching freshmen. Is that the only level that you're teaching?
Oh, no, I'm on the faculty officially as a Latin Americanist because my dissertation was about Mexico, 19th century Mexico. I mean, it can't be more different than this. So my wife doesn't like me doing this. She wants me to focus on the dead Mexicans because they've been dead for 100 years or more. So I focus on, as my academic field before this was on 19th century Mexico. And I teach Latin America.
And currently the classes that you teach, in what department?
In the history department, so American history 1302, right? So yeah, everybody loves history. So I wish my students did this too, but they do sometimes. I love teaching history. I still, it's so funny. I started as a history buff, and that's what I read as a kid. But then it's a job, and so I really wish I could read for pleasure again after they beat it out of you in grad school.
There's an analogy here with the West Side Story.
Yeah.
The Irish and the Puerto Rican.
Oh, right, yeah. The mix, yeah.
This phenomenon is actually transcultural.
Oh, yeah, it's intracultural, and that's how it is sort of in Southern California and in Texas. It's mostly, now, the epilogue to this is that by the early 1990s, there had been Mexican migration into San Jose. A lot of them through LA and through Central California, and they identified with a different area, so they called themselves Southerners or Sureños, and they adopted the color blue and the number 13, if you ever see that. So the people in San Jose, the people I'm talking about, because they claimed San Jose as their home base, and they wore red, they adopted the color red and the number 14, because 14th, N is the 14th letter in the alphabet. And so the Southerners, the Sureños, align with the Mexican Mafia. And the Norteños, Northerners, align with the Nuestra Familia. So it's a much smaller community, but no less crazy, I guess, right? But by that time, you would have the red and blue among Mexicans and Mexican Americans. So the blue was mostly people either Mexicans from there or who identified with those communities and were bilingual. The other side were not, they did not always tend to be bilingual. Most of the time they weren't. They were like Americans. And so,
In terms of trying to head off the self-destructive behaviors that evolved, particularly as they enter grade schools and into junior high and high school, has your research give you some idea of what is deficient or missing in the lives of these people and make them susceptible? They have a want to within themselves, a want to identify
right.
with some violent or self-destructive
oh yeah.
Figure.
From a personal and from an academic standpoint and from doing these interviews, you know, what it comes down to is something to do. Idle hands, the devil's workshop, right? I remember my mother told me you could pick a martial art you want to get involved in. I said, at first Kung Fu, but my friends were in Judo. I ended up hating Judo. And she said, you know what, you get nothing now. And so, yeah, I became a bad kid. Now she says, oh, I'm sorry I did that. But it's just feeling like you belong somewhere, that you're worth something. And with the wider community in these suburbs, right, going to better schools, driving better cars, getting the better marijuana, right? There's sort of a subtle inferiority kind of thing going on where they cling to who they are, they cling to their own, and that particular culture, not necessarily Mexican culture, but it's that culture that they created because they did not have, as James Diego Vigil says, they did not have access to the wider community, or either in services or in contact with people or in contact with people doing good things. Does that make sense? And when they did have contact like that, they tended to gravitate to their own who weren't doing these kinds of things. Does that make sense? So, but just to be fair, from the north side of San Jose, where I'm from, now we have columnist Marcos Bertone of the Sacramento Bee. There's a Hollywood producer. He's Italian-American. Who's from that neighborhood, Hollywood producer now, or something like that. A Japanese American, the young man, we were kids together. He's like doing real well in business. I've looked all these guys up if I didn't talk to them. So I was like, what happened to them? And then, you know, there's some success stories out there, right? No matter what, I didn't meet a lot of the people until I went to college. And they grew up in the same places, they just happened to go to college, right? So, but I did know people in the early 90s when I was a reporter that still lived in the neighborhood, even though they had a college degree. Like my friend had a degree in physics. His name, Beto. We'd be drinking beer, and he'd be doing, I'm saying, what the hell are you doing? But he said, yeah, if you come visit me, once in a while, you're going to have to duck because somebody's going to come around trying to shoot you. I was like, what? I've been away a long time. So, because before you know it, they're all shooting. They're, you know, just shooting this and shooting that, which they didn't really have access to in the old days of the 70s. I remember there was a guy, I believe in the Nuestra Familia, because I hung out in apartments where these guys were, and he was walking up the stairs with a .38 revolver, snub nose, I guess. And we were like, oh, a gun. Hey, that's not a real gun. Oh, yes, it is. And he showed us the gun. He's like 30 years old. And we're like, oh, it's a gun. Let me use it. All right? You know, because guns were strange things. And if you had one, it was like, oh, we got a gun. But by the early 90s, everybody had that, yeah. So I remember when they were shooting at you, the first gun battles in San Jose I've heard of in the 1970s, they actually had like 22s. I mean, you know, not the kind of guns you would have now, so revolvers and 22s, not like the 9mm, I guess. So, well, thank you all. If any more questions or?
Yeah, one question.
Oh, thanks. Sorry, Rock.
I want to really two questions. One, my understanding, this area never dealt with desegregation.
No, never. Because there's not a large black pop. Never was a large black pop, even to this day. That was it was mostly because of the Mexican-American situation with the San Jose Unified. But other school districts did adopt, in the wake of that, like desegregation committees, although they never went to court with any of that, right? So there was one high school that did have African-Americans and Mexican-Americans in it. That was across town. But ours was almost exclusively Mexican-American. Very small group of immigrants that we looked down on. The girls were pretty, but they wouldn't even look at somebody like me because I wasn't from there. So, there was a divide.
Connection with cartels.
Nowadays, probably. Yeah, so yeah, there's nobody that doesn't. And I know the Nuestra Familia today, I don't know anybody involved in it today. They're still out there, but I know that they do have connections with cartels. There's almost no way around that with any kind of drug traffic now. And as a matter of fact, there was one point where the Hells Angels made a deal with the cartels for the methamphetamine trade in California. Now, this is a magazine article from like 30 years ago. I don't know how much has changed, but that's how they started penetrating like way back then. And they're in Washington State as well. So they're all over the place, yeah. Thank you, Rock. Well,
Thank you.
and thank you all. Oh, thank you all. Thank you.
That's fascinating. Thank you all for coming. Next month's program is Terry Thomas. He's going to be talking about the Air Force Association and everything that they're doing and are involved in. And let's see, next coming up, we also have Yuki Golf, if you like to play miniature golf, in 2 weeks on the 12th. That'll be out here. And the Cotton Conference is also coming up on November 9th. And Frontier Day is November 2nd. I think it's the 2nd. So enjoy. Have a great day. Thank you.
This video has been brought to you by GEUS. GEUS is your community-owned provider for electricity, internet, cable TV, and true local programming.